Before Dangote, before oil money, before independence, wealth in Nigeria followed rules that were never written, but strictly enforced. Under British colonial rule, Africans were expected to work, to trade at small scales, and to assist European commerce. They were not expected to own fleets. They were not expected to dominate logistics. And they were certainly not expected to become indispensable. To the British Empire itself, economic power was carefully guarded. Banks, shipping, insurance, railways, these were the arteries of empire. And Africans were deliberately kept at the edges. Yet history records rare moments when the system bends, not because it wants to, but because it must. During the Second World War, the British Empire found itself stretched thin. Supplies had to move. Produce had to reach ports. Military logistics had to function, even in West Africa. And in colonial Nigeria, one African businessman had quietly built something the empire could not easily replace. His transport fleets moved goods faster than expected. His networks reached where colonial systems struggled. For nearly 3 years, parts of the colonial economy were sustained by the resources and infrastructure of a single Nigerian. His name was Sir Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu. At a time when most Africans aspired to work under the colonial government or trade cautiously under European supervision, Ojukwu made a different choice. He chose ownership. That choice would lift an orphaned boy into unimaginable wealth and place him at the center of Nigeria's most turbulent history. To understand how this was possible, we must return to the world that shaped him, a world where ambition was dangerous and success by an African was never accidental. Sir Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu was born around 1909 into a Nigeria that did not yet exist as a nation, only as a territory administered for British convenience. He was born in what is today Anambra State, to parents who were already navigating the narrow spaces available to Africans under colonial rule. His father was a produce merchant, his mother a trader. They were not wealthy by imperial standards, but they understood something crucial. Trade was one of the few doors left slightly open to Africans in a controlled economy. That door would not stay open forever. While still young, Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu lost both parents. In colonial Africa, orphanhood was not merely emotional loss. It was economic vulnerability. There was no welfare system, no safety net, no empire-funded compassion. Survival depended on extended family and personal resolve. For Ojukwu, grief arrived early, but so did responsibility. He did not inherit protection. He inherited uncertainty. By his late teens, it became clear that staying in the village would confine him to the narrow ceiling. Colonial society imposed on Africans. The path forward lay elsewhere. Lagos, the colonial capital, the port city, the place where opportunity and exploitation existed side by side. Around the age of 20, Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu left eastern Nigeria and traveled to Lagos, not with capital, not with influence, but with observation and intent. Lagos in the 1920s was a city divided. European quarters enjoyed infrastructure, banking access, and administrative authority. Africans lived in crowded districts, supplying labor, produce, and services to an economy they did not control. Ojukwu entered this world at the bottom. He took work as a clerk at John Holt, one of the largest European trading companies in West Africa. On paper, this was an ordinary colonial job. In reality, it was a vantage point. From behind ledgers and manifests, Ojukwu studied how goods moved, who controlled transport, who dictated prices, who absorbed risk, and who collected profit. He saw African traders pushed into dependency, while European firms controlled shipping, storage, and access to capital. He also saw something else: inefficiency, delays, gaps, bottlenecks, places where the colonial system assumed Africans would never compete. Ojukwu did not protest the system. He memorized it. This was not rebellion, it was preparation. By the time he left John Holt, he did not leave as a disgruntled employee, but as a man who understood the architecture of power. And once you understand the structure, you begin to see where it can be entered, and eventually, where it can be broken. By the late 1920s, Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu made a decision most Africans in colonial Nigeria did not dare to make. He left security. John Holt provided a wage, a predictable future, and the limited safety colonial employment offered. But it also imposed a ceiling. Ojukwu had seen too much to remain beneath it. From his time as a clerk, he understood a simple truth. Profit did not lie in selling goods alone. It lay in moving them. European firms controlled shipping routes, from inland markets to coastal ports. African traders depended on them, and paid heavily for that dependence. Ojukwu stepped into this gap. His first ventures were small, cautious, and entirely African-owned. He traded textiles. He bought produce. He reinvested relentlessly. There were setbacks, lost consignments, delayed payments. In a system designed to limit African expansion, failure was expected. But Ojukwu adjusted. He did not attempt to compete with Europeans at sea. He focused on land transport. The neglected arteries of colonial commerce, roads linking eastern Nigeria to Lagos, were poorly served, expensive, and unreliable. Ojukwu saw opportunity where the empire saw inconvenience. By the early 1930s, he began acquiring trucks, not as symbols of success, but as tools of leverage. Each truck reduced dependence. Each route increased bargaining power. African traders noticed. European firms quietly paid attention. What began as survival was becoming infrastructure. And in colonial economies, whoever controls infrastructure eventually controls terms. Ojukwu was no longer observing the system. He was inserting himself into it, deliberately, strategically, and at personal risk. By the early 1930s, Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu made a strategic decision that changed the rules of trade in eastern Nigeria. He anchored his operations in Onitsha, a commercial nerve center on the River Niger. From there, he established Uru stores. It was not just a shop. It was a hub. Textiles, bicycles, spare parts, imported goods once monopolized by European firms, now passed through an African-owned channel. Traders no longer needed to travel to Lagos. Uru stores brought Legos to them. But there was a problem. Goods arrived faster than they could be moved. Traders waited days, sometimes weeks, for transport back to their towns and markets. The empire had solved ports and shipping. It had neglected roads. Ojukwu saw the weakness. His response was decisive. He purchased a second-hand truck, first to move his own goods, then to serve other traders for a fee. Demand surged immediately. One truck became three. Three became fleets. What began as a support service evolved into Ojukwu Transport Company, one of the earliest large-scale indigenous transport firms in colonial Nigeria. His trucks connected Onitsha to Asaba and beyond, linking river ports to inland economies. Traders followed reliability. European firms noticed competition. Colonial officials noticed efficiency. Ojukwu's advantage was not just ownership. It was speed, trust, consistency. In a colonial system built to exclude Africans from scale, he achieved scale anyway. By the late 1930s, his transport network had become indispensable, not because it was favored, but because it worked. Roads that once symbolized limitation now generated leverage. Uru stores fed the trucks fed the markets, and the markets fed an empire that no longer belonged solely to Europeans. In 1939, the world went to war. Britain needed men, it needed resources, and above all, it needed logistics. Colonial Nigeria became a supply base. Roads mattered, trucks mattered, and suddenly, Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu mattered. His transport network was no longer just commercial, it was strategic. The British colonial government contracted him to move military supplies, equipment, and produce critical to the war effort. This was not charity, it was dependence. An African businessman, operating fleets built outside imperial favor, had become essential to sustaining the empire's war machine in West Africa. For 3 years, Nigeria's internal logistics leaned heavily on his infrastructure. The irony was complete. An empire that restricted African enterprise now relied on it. Ojukwu did not protest. He negotiated. Wartime contracts multiplied his wealth. Fleet sizes expanded. Routes increased. Capital accumulated at a scale few Africans had ever touched. By the war's end, he was no longer merely rich. He was too big to ignore. Britain rewarded loyalty the only way it knew how. Titles, access, proximity to power. Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu was knighted by the crown, not because he belonged to the empire, but because the empire had needed him. When the war ended, Britain exhaled. Nigeria accelerated. Trade surged. Produce moved faster. Cities expanded. And Sir Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu was already positioned ahead of the curve. His transport fleet exploded. Over 200 trucks by 1950, not owned on paper, owned in steel, rubber, and road dominance. But Ojukwu understood concentration risk. Empires fall when wealth sits in one place. So he diversified. Real estate in Lagos, stakes in banks, board seats in multinational firms, African Continental Bank, Shell, United Africa Company, even John Holt, the firm where he once earned a clerk's wage. This was not symbolic inclusion, it was economic penetration. By the early 1950s, Sir Louis was not just wealthy, he was systemically embedded in Nigeria's colonial economy, so influential that the colonial government considered him to chair the Nigerian Ports Authority in 1959. He declined, not from humility, but leverage. Independence was approaching, and Ojukwu was already operating at a level beyond political appointment. He had become what colonial structures feared most, an African capitalist who did not need permission. By the 1950s, Sir Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu stood at a crossroads few Africans ever reached. Wealth had given him access. Influence demanded a choice. Colonial Nigeria was fragmenting, regions asserting identity, politicians negotiating futures, and power shifting from governors to indigenous elites. Ojukwu did not stand outside this moment. He entered it. He contested and won a parliamentary seat for his district, not as a career politician, but as a stakeholder. Inside the legislature, he clashed with protocol, resisted performative politics, and openly challenged disrespect. When proceedings crossed his personal red lines, he walked out. The act cost him his seat, but it preserved his posture. Ojukwu had never relied on office to legitimize power. Outside Parliament, his influence expanded. He became a major financier of the NCNC, supporting nationalist leaders, pushing for independence. He funded campaigns, he backed institutions, and when independence finally came, Nigeria's first national celebrations were reportedly financed by him. The new government wanted more. He was offered the role of Minister of Finance. he declined. Instead, he helped lay the foundation for Nigeria's first stock exchange, a system he understood better than any cabinet seat. Sir Louis chose structure over spotlight, markets over ministries, but history rarely allows power to remain uncontested. By the mid-1960s, Sir Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu had become everything the colonial system said Africans could not be: wealthy, influential, embedded. However, history is rarely clean. It passes through families, and in the case of Sir Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu, it passed through his son. Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu was not raised in scarcity. He was educated, disciplined, and shaped by privilege, earned before independence. Where the father believed in markets, the son believed in structure. Where one trusted economic leverage, the other trusted command. Their divergence was not rebellion. It was generation. As Nigeria fractured under post-colonial strain, ethnic violence, political exclusion, and inherited colonial boundaries pushed the nation toward rupture. Biafra did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged from unresolved imperial design. Sir Louis opposed secession, not out of disloyalty to his people, but from fear of fragmentation and the loss of economic cohesion. He had spent decades stitching Nigeria together through trade. His son chose a different path, one many still regard as principled, defensive, and historically justified. The disagreement was never about ambition. It was about what survival required in a system the empire left broken. In their final meeting, there were no public arguments, only silence, the kind that follows when history moves faster than reconciliation. In the next chapter, that silence becomes permanent. As the life of Nigeria's first billionaire ends suddenly, amid tension, uncertainty, and an empire on the brink of collapse. September 1966. Nigeria was no longer at ease with itself. Coups had shaken the state. Trust had collapsed. The eastern region stood at a crossroads. On the night of September 12th, Sir Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu traveled to Enugu, not as a politician, not as a negotiator, but as a father, seeking restraint, dialogue, and preservation. He met his son at the Eastern Government House. Accounts suggest the visit was tense. Protocol was strained. Time passed. Words were few. Sir Louis advised caution. He urged alternatives to separation, not out of fear, but out of experience. He had built across Nigeria. He understood what fragmentation could destroy. The council was not rejected loudly. It was simply absorbed. That night, Sir Louis returned quietly. No public statements, no confrontations, only silence. In the early hours of September 13, 1966, Sir Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu died in his sleep, reportedly from a heart attack. He was 57 years old. Nigeria lost its first great capitalist on the eve of its greatest fracture. There were no state funerals, no national pause. The country was already falling apart. War does not negotiate. It reassigns ownership. When the Nigerian Civil War erupted, Sir Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu was no longer alive. To defend what he had built, his empire stood exposed, stretched across regions now at war with each other. In the East, parts of his accessible wealth were drawn into sustaining Biafra, not as personal ambition, but as emergency survival within a collapsing state. In Lagos and the West, assets linked to him were frozen, seized, or reassigned under wartime authority. Companies did not wait. Boards moved on. Shares shifted hands. Properties changed control, sometimes legally, sometimes opportunistically. This was not unique to Ojukwu. War punishes scale. The larger the footprint, the greater the exposure. By the time the war ended, his financial architecture, once unified, once continental in reach, was fragmented. Some holdings were recovered. Many were not. Not because of failure, but because history does not preserve balance during collapse. Sir Louis had built a national empire before a nation had stabilized. And when the state fractured, the empire fractured with it. Sir Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu was no longer measured by what remained, but by what had been proven possible. Before oil, before billionaires became brands, before independence had a flag, an African orphan built scale inside a system designed to deny it. He showed that capital could be accumulated without proximity to the state. That infrastructure could be owned, not rented from empire. That African enterprise could be strategic, disciplined, and continental in ambition. His life exposed a truth rarely taught. Colonial economies were not unbeatable. They were dependent on African labor, dependent on African markets, and in moments of crisis, dependent on African capital. Sir Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu forced the empire to acknowledge this, not through protest, but through performance. His story is not one of loss. It is one of precedent, a blueprint interrupted, but never invalidated. And in a Nigeria still negotiating its economic sovereignty, his life remains a reminder. Wealth is not just accumulation, it is leverage. And leverage, once demonstrated, cannot be erased from history. In our final chapter, we return to the beginning to answer the question. History keeps asking, who was Sir Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu, really? Long before Nigeria measured wealth in oil, contracts, or global rankings, Sir Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu measured it in control. Control of movement, control of capital, control of leverage. He did not inherit a nation. He anticipated one. He proved that African wealth could exist without permission, without apology, and without dependency on empire. Today, his name is often overshadowed by louder fortunes. But history is not a competition of noise. It is a record of firsts. And before Dangote, there was Ojukwu. If this story changed how you see wealth, power, or Africa's economic past, then this channel is for you. Subscribe to Echoes of the Ancients for untold histories, suppressed legacies, and the truths that still shape our world. Because what was done once can be done again.